Hi everyone, today we'll be going over accounts October-November 2021, paper 2 and question number 3. This is paper 2 which consists questions of 90 marks and it also has a time limit of 90 minutes. And since question number 3 is of 15 marks, we will be attempting to solve this question under 15 minutes. So without any delay, let's get started. Martina has prepared the following sales ledger control account for the month of August 2021. All sales are in credit. Alright, then Martina produced a list of all customers' account balances at 31st August 2021, totaling 10,020. So this is the total for the customer account balances, whereas the total balance for the sales ledger control account was 11,470. She discovered the following errors that had been made in the records. So firstly, let's have a look at the sales ledger control account. So balance BD should be on this side. This is the correct one. Sales journal is also recorded on the debit side, so that's the correct as well. And we have sales returns journal, which is recorded on the credit side. That's correct. And we have bank. This relates to the amount we received in return for the credit sales. So this is correct as well. But we can see that there is a discounts received. And we're talking about sales ledger control account. So if we're talking about sales, the discount can only be allowed because we're allowing discounts while the customers take goods from us. So there cannot be a discounts received in the sales ledger control account. So this is an error as well. So we need to correct it. Then the balance CD, so that's the correct one. All right, this is the first error. First, let's look at the question. So for the first part, we need to prepare an adjusted sales ledger control account. So obviously the first error that we need to correct would be that of the discounts received. Now let's have a look at the other errors that Martina discovered. The first one is discounts allowed of 11,090 had been entered in the customer's account but had not been entered into the control account. So since this discount allowed has not been mentioned in the sales ledger control account, we need to correct this error. Secondly, we have a credit transfer from a customer of 420 had been correctly entered in the cash book but had been credited to the customer's account. So this is an error relating to the customer account. And since it was entered correctly in the cash book, we can assume that this amount had been entered correctly in the sales ledger control account. So we can easily skip the second error. This does not relate to the sales ledger control account. Thirdly, there is a credit balance of 60 on a customer's account had been recorded on the list of balances as a debit balance. So this again is an error relating to the customer account. So this balance does not really affect the balance on the sales ledger control account. So we can skip this for the first part. Then we have a contract to the purchase ledger of 860, which had been entered in the customer's sales ledger account but had not been entered in the control account. So since this amount is not mentioned in the control account, we need to rectify this error. So for number, we have to consider it in the first part. Then we have a check received from a customer of 380 had been returned unpaid by the bank. So this is an error relating to a dismissed check, right? So this should have deducted the balance on our sales ledger control account. But since the check had been returned unpaid by the bank, we need to rectify this error in the sales ledger control account as well. Next, we have a check of $20 which had been sent to a customer by Martina who had overpaid his account, and the payment had been correctly processed in both the cash book and the customer's account but had been posted to the purchase ledger control account in error. So from the cash book, this amount of 20 should have been posted to the sales ledger control account, but it had been posted to the purchase ledger control account, which means that this amount of 20 has yet not been mentioned in the sales ledger control account, so we need to do that. So this also is an error we need to rectify for the first part. Okay, these are the errors. So firstly, let's start with the discounts received. So this should not have been included in the sales ledger control account. So since this is included in the credit side, in order to rectify this error, we have to include the same amount in the debit side. So we will record the amount of 280 under the heading of discount received on the debit side for the sales ledger control account. Let's do that. So we have discounts received of 280. Okay, let's have a look at the another error. Discounts allowed of 1,190. So this had not been entered. So we know that the discounts allowed always reduces the trade receivables balance, and whatever reduction in the trade receivables are always recorded on the credit side. So we will record this amount of 1,190 under the heading of discount allowed on the credit side. Let's do that. So we have discounts allowed, and it amounts to 1,190. Let's have a look at this second one. So a contra to the purchase ledger. So contra is basically a cutoff. So there are two people or two parties, A and B. A purchased goods worth of 100 from B. So he needs to pay 100 to B. Then B purchased goods worth 200 from A. So if we divide this 200 into 100 and 100, we can just cancel out this amount of 100 that A needs to pay to B and another 100 that B needs to pay to A. So this cancel off or cut off during trade is known as a contra. So obviously it reduces the balance of the trade receivables, and again the reduction in the balance of trade receivables are always recorded on the credit side. So this amount of 860 will be recorded on the credit side under the heading of the contra. Let's do that. So we have contra and it amounts to 860. Let's have a look at another error. A check received from a customer of 380 had been returned unpaid by the bank. So we already deducted 380 from the trade receivables balance, but since the check had been returned unpaid by the bank, obviously the trade receivables balance should be increased by 380. And the increment in the balance of trade receivables are always recorded on the debit side. So we will record this amount of 380 on the debit side under the heading of bank, since we are talking about a check. Let's do that. So we can write it down as bank, and it amounts to 380. Let's have a look at another error. Martina had sent a check for $20 to a customer who had overpaid his account. So overpayment of the account obviously increases the balance in trade receivables. So in order to record this, we will do that in the debit side, and the amount is 20. And we can record it under the heading of purchase ledger control account, since that's the error we are rectifying. Let's do that. So that will be purchase ledger control account, and this has a balance of 20. Alright, we've already included all of the errors that we identified earlier, so we can just figure out the closing balance. So since the opening balance is on the debit side, closing balance will be on the credit side. So we can write it down as balance CD or balance carried down. So let's calculate the total. Since we are trying to figure the balancing figure on the credit side, we will first have to total the debit side. So in order to do so, we will just add these four amounts. So that's 11,470 plus 280 plus 380 plus 20, which gives the total to be 12,150. The total should be the same for both sides. Now, in order to figure out this balancing figure, we just need to subtract these amounts from the total amount. So that's 12,150 minus 1,190 minus 860, which gives the closing balance to be 10,100. Now, the thing to remember here is that we need to write down the closing balance as the opening balance for the next month. So since the closing balance is on the credit side, the opening balance will be on the debit side. So we can write it down as balance BD. And we have the same amount as the closing balance, so that's just 10,100. This concludes the first part. Let's move to the second one. For the second part, we need to prepare an adjusted list of sales ledger balances to agree with the adjusted sales ledger control account balance in the first part. So the adjusted sales ledger control account balance was 10,100, so we need the same balance for the sales ledger as well. Let's have a look at the errors. So we already identified that the error 1, 4, 5, and 6 related to the sales ledger control account, so we don't have to look at it again. So let's look at error 2 and 3. A credit transfer from a customer of 420 had been correctly entered in the cash book, but had been credited to the customer's account as 240. So what should have been recorded as 420 was recorded as 240. So if out of this 420, 240 was recorded, then the remaining balance is 180, right? So we need to record this in our sales ledger, and we're talking about a credit transfer. So obviously it reduces the value of the trade receivables, which means that we will be subtracting this value of 110, and we can write it down as check since we're talking about a credit transfer from a customer, meaning that the customer is paying the amount of 420. Let's write it down. So we will be subtracting under the heading of bank the amount paid by the customer. So instead of 420, we had only subtracted 240. So now we need to subtract the remaining balance of 180. Let's have a look at another error. We have a credit balance of 60 on a customer's account, which had been recorded on the list of balances as a debit balance. So obviously credit balance again, so this needs to be reduced. So the value of 60 should be a negative 60. But we already included it on the debit balance, meaning that we added the 60. So if we are to subtract 60 once, then this just cancels each other and there will be no balance indicating that we subtracted $60 for the credit balance on a customer's account. So instead of writing 60 once, we need to subtract 60 twice so that once it gets cancelled out with the added debit balance and the remaining one will remain as a balance indicating a credit balance on the customer's account. So instead of just subtracting 60, we need to subtract 60 plus 60, which gives us the balance of 120. So we can just subtract this under the heading of credit balance. Let's do that. So this has a balance of 120. All right. So if we are to subtract 180 and 120 from 10,020, obviously it does not give a balance of 10,100 because that's the balance we require, because that is the balance for this adjusted sales ledger control account. So obviously we're missing out on some error. Let's have a look again. So the error 1 indicates discount allowed, which had been entered in the customer's account. So obviously we do not need to consider this. We've already considered error 2 and error 3. For error 4, we have a contrast, so we do not need to consider this as well. For the fifth one, we are talking about a check that had been received from a customer of 380 and had been returned unpaid. No entries had been made in Martina's books of accounts. So no entries in books of accounts indicates that we did not enter this transaction in both the sales ledger control account and the sales ledger. So this is the amount that we need to consider in our sales ledger balances as well. Since we're talking about a check received from a customer which had been returned unpaid by the bank, obviously this increases the balance on the trade receivables, which means that we will be adding this amount of 380 to the sales ledger and we can record it under the heading of unpaid check. Let's do that. So since this increases the value of the trade receivables, we need to add this amount. And this will have a balance of 380. Now these are all the errors that needed to be considered in order to figure out the adjusted sales ledger balance. So let's figure out the total. That's just going to be 10,020 minus 180 minus 120 plus 380, which gives the adjusted total of the sales ledger balances to be 10,100, which is the same as the balance for the adjusted sales ledger control account, which means that both of these solutions are correct. Since this concludes the second part, we can now move on to the third part. We need to explain how the preparation of a sales ledger control account assists in the prevention of fraud. So firstly, sales ledger control account is maintained by a member of staff who is not responsible for the particular ledger. So let's write that down. Sales ledger control account is maintained by a member of staff who is not responsible for the particular ledger and secondly, the segregation of duties act as a deterrent to fraud and makes the discovery of fraud easier because we're segregating the duties for preparing the sales ledger and preparing sales ledger control account. So if there is a mistake in any one of those, we can easily figure out the fraud, and it prevents the staffs from doing so as well. Let's write that down. So this segregation of duties act as a deterrent to fraud and makes the discovery of fraud easier. Alright, this concludes the third part. Let's move to the fourth one now. We need to state 3 types of error that will not be identified by preparing a sales ledger control account. So the first one is error of omission. This kind of error takes place when we completely omit any kind of transaction in the books of accounts. Then there is error of commission. These types of error arises when the accounts are recorded debit or credit to the correct account but to the wrong ledger. Then lastly, we have error of principal. These kinds of error arises when the entry of the transaction violates a fundamental principle of accounting. So let's write these 3 errors down. The first one is error of omission. Second one is error of commission. And lastly, we have error of principal. Alright, this concludes the fourth part as well as this question. If you found this video useful, make sure you like the video and leave a comment below. And make sure you're subscribed to the channel and hit the bell icon so that you do not miss any of these videos in the future. Thank you.